Hey, Hotep, hey, this is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. I'm a talk show host, researcher, lecturer, writer, and historian. I am here with one of my friends and one of our Grandmaster Scholar warriors, Tony Browder, historian and archaeologist. How you doing today, Tony?
I'm wonderful, man. It's good to be able to connect with you again.
Absolutely, absolutely, man. I
Been a
know
minute.
yes, it's been a minute. We've talked through Facebook, man, and been trying to catch up with you in and out of the country, things like that. But Tony was one of my first interviews that I did in 2010 when I launched the African History Network show. And we're celebrating our 13th year anniversary. First launched March 10th, 2010, the African History Network show. And many people know Tony is the author of one of my favorite books, and we use it in my online history classes. I teach Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. If you don't have this book, you have to get this book, okay? Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization by Tony Browder. So we want to have this conversation. I was talking to Tony yesterday, Friday, and today. We want to have this conversation dealing with why Nile Valley civilization history matters. And we're going to talk about some African queens, and also with Queen Cleopatra, we're going to put this in a historical context as well. All right. So, Tony, let people know just briefly some of your historical background and some of your research.
Well, I am formally trained as an artist, a graphic designer. My interest in history was piqued on February the 21st, 1977. That was probably before some of your listeners were born. That was when I met Ivan Van Sertima. Dr. Ivan Van Sertima was speaking at Georgetown Law School. He had just previously published They Came Before Columbus, the African Presence in America. And it was during that lecture that Van Sertima documented the pre-Columbian presence of Africans from the Nile Valley who had built ships, navigated the Nile River, Mediterranean Sea, and made numerous journeys to the Americas, principally in Mexico, where they brought their cargo of knowledge, astronomy, architecture, engineering, and agriculture, and influenced, helped to jumpstart civilization in the Americas, and that they were known to these ancient people as the Olmecs. And there were at least 20 large heads of these stone-carved heads of these Africans that were placed on ceremonial temples and mounds throughout Mexico. And what really blew my mind was when Van Sertima said that these Africans who had come to Mexico from the Nile Valley were from Egypt, and they were black. They were from Kush, and they were black. And this was the first time in my life I had ever heard anyone say this, because everything that I had read, everything that I had seen in television, everything that I had learned in every school that I had attended, even though they were predominantly black schools, taught just the reverse. So my mind was blown upon hearing Dr. Van Sertima's lecture, and that prompted me to begin to revisit everything that I had learned. And then I discovered what I referred to as forbidden knowledge. Information, historical information, which has been intentionally withheld from certain populations in order to influence how they see themselves, how they see the world, and how they interact with others. So it was my interest in learning this forbidden history that prompted my travels to Egypt, that prompted my my writing, my interest in studying this information. And another major turning point in my life was in September of 1984, when Ivan Van Sertima, along with Charles French and Asa Hilliard, sponsored the Nile Valley Conference at Morehouse College. And that 4-day event cemented to me the power of knowledge. And the interesting thing about this gathering was that it featured not just African scholars and African American scholars, but European scholars who also understood that the historical knowledge of the past had been fragmented and had been erroneously presented as historical truths. So beginning to become aware of the fact that whoever controls your knowledge of the past controls your conception of yourself in the present has really framed everything that I've done. So the work that I've done, the writings that I've done, the study tours that I've done are all designed to introduce people to historical information that it may not have been a part of their formal educational process, but information that is critical to their ability to determine who they are and how they can move into the world and through the world and better interact with others.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Now, in just a point of note, because people are asking, so today is Sunday, April 23rd, 2023. We are live right now. So people are asking that. And you set the tone for this conversation, Tony, because I got to ask you a question about the Olmecs as well. Okay. Because you just mentioned the Olmecs, right? And I teach about this in my class. And in Dr. David Imhotep's book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence, he talks about the Olmec, Mandinka, Egyptian or ancient Kemetic connection. Okay. I want to have you explain that in just a minute. And then also, okay, CS, thanks for your support. If you want to support the African History Network, visit our website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. You all can support us through Cash App, $, the AHN show through Cash App, and PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN show. And when you do it through YouTube, they take a third of it, just so people know, because they're trying to support through YouTube. Okay. Also give your website, Tony, and let people know how they can support your work. And then I'm going to have you answer that question about the Olmecs.
Sure. Well, our website for IKG is www.ikg-info.com, ikg-info.com. That organization turned 41 years old this past February. So we've been doing this for a minute.
Yes.
And it's a process that is near and dear to my heart because it's all about raising awareness and, as a consequence, raising consciousness. So with regards to the Olmec, I was blessed, brother, to have traveled to Mexico twice with Van Sertima.
Mm-hmm.
And to see these Olmec heads. And one of the most important parts of our two journeys together was that Van Sertima took the group to the home of Alexander von Wutenow.
Yes.
Von Wutenow was a former German diplomat who left the German diplomatic corps as Hitler rose in power and demanded that every diplomat swear their allegiance to the Nazi party. So he resigned rather than do that and settled in Mexico City and became a historian of note. Von Wutenow had the largest collection of Olmec figurines, terracotta Olmec figurines in the world. And he literally took us through his house, took us through his museum and showed us these pieces and explained who the Olmecs were. Now, what's significant to put this in historical context,
okay,
that we've got these heads, and Van Sertima was not the first scholar to write about the pre-Columbian African presence in America. Leo Weiner was one of the first scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And even Von Wutenow himself has written extensively on this subject matter. So he's showing us that the selection of the very clay that was used to depict these Olmecs was a dark brown clay. And they had access to various colors clay. So he very skillfully and intelligently showed us the difference between the Olmec people and the Toltec people or the Mayan people based on the type of clay that was used to represent these people. So color was an important aspect of his presentation. Another important aspect, man, is that the year, I'm blanking on the year, but
okay.
The year that we met him was the year that the Berlin Wall had failed.
Okay.
Von Wutenow now had an opportunity to go back to Germany because his family were very wealthy and landowners, and so he had a prescribed period of time to go back to Germany and reclaim the land of his forefathers that was appropriated during the Nazi regime. So when we came back to Mexico the following year, we met with Von Wutenow again, and he told us some phenomenal stories about his trip back home to Germany, where he had not been for over 40 years. And his colleagues, some of his colleagues who were Egyptologists, and shared with us that they had evidence of additional Kushite kings, specifically of the 25th dynasty, who are not a part of the historical record, right? So
right.
To be able to be in the presence of people who have access to firsthand documentation and can see beyond the veil and add more depth and clarity to a history that has been marginalized was significant to me, was critically important to me. And to be able to travel with Van Sertima, a highly respected scholar who was instrumental in transforming the lives of hundreds of thousands of people throughout the United States and around the world, was also critically important to me. But one other factor that hurt me to my heart was to learn that Van Sertima was denied tenure at Rutgers University because he had written They Came Before Columbus, the African Presence in America. Matter of fact, Van Sertima told me that writing that book was the end of his academic career. And what that says,
Wow.
what it speaks to, is that there are organizations, institutions, and very powerful people at play who want to make sure that certain information never becomes a part of school curricula. Certain information is intentionally withheld because it will affect the consciousness of tens of thousands and maybe even millions of people around the world. So this is no joke. This is no game. This is something that I take very seriously.
Yes,
and
you do.
One of the things that Van Sertima taught me that I hold on to is that one should never say anything in public that you can't validate with at least 4 sources. So it's not about just popping off.
Yes.
Just because
The mouth
you're
poppers. The mouth poppers.
No,
You
it's
can't
about
do that.
being serious, and it's about understanding that this is not a sprint. This is a marathon. And that we have to be able to transform the consciousness of tens of millions of people who have been denied the right to read, to write, to reason, and to articulate what they know. Right. So it's about participating in an ancestral tradition that we are bound to be heartfully engaged in for the benefit of all the people who never had the opportunity to do what we're doing right now. So I take this very seriously, and I don't believe in getting caught in the fray. I'm looking at the long game. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And it's about shaping the world that our children's children are going to inhabit. I also want to share with you, if you don't mind, man.
Go ahead.
We talked briefly about this concept of agnotology.
Yes.
Agnotology. And there's a book by that name that was published several years ago. And the definition of agnotology will sound familiar to some of your listeners who are familiar with what you do. Okay. Agnotology is described as the study of culturally induced ignorance or doubt, particularly the publication or dissemination via the media of inaccurate or misleading scientific data and the creation of institutions to promote disinformation. All right.
Okay.
So
it's spelled agnotology.
Agnotology.
Right.
Agnotology. All right.
Right. And I'm looking at this this Stanford University Press. I'm going to show this on the screen here. Just a second. Go ahead.
Okay. And so for those of us who have been studying this form of brainwashing, if you will, or propaganda, if you will, we should be aware of the book that was written by Dr. Carter G. Woodson in 1933 called The Miseducation of the Negro. Right. So agnotology is another word for miseducation. It is the intentional marketing of ignorance in order to move people in a specific direction. And so the media, based on my experience and my background in the media, marketing, advertising, and design, I know very clearly that the media, i.e. social media, is the most powerful form of mental manipulation ever created in the history of the world. And so we have heard about, Russians planting disinformation on social media in order to stir up animus in the United States during previous presidential elections.
Correct.
So folk who understand the power of misinformation and the power of being an unseen hand in the internet, in cyberspace. You don't know where these messages are coming from. People have a tendency to be, a large segment of the population is addicted to this information. They're addicted to information that excites them and moves them to emote as opposed to moving them to think and process what they're doing. And so it's so critically important at this particular point in time in history, Michael, that we understand how we're being manipulated by information, and how critical it is that as we move through the next presidential election cycle, and what happens after that, how we will continue to be manipulated. Emotional buttons will be pushed. And as they're pushed, people will think less. They'll talk more and think less and engage in activities that would be detrimental to the well-being of society as a whole. So it's important to choose our arguments carefully and to have your talking points down pat and to know that those talking points are grounded in history,
Yes.
not mythology, not anger, not racism, but documented facts that can be substantiated. So when two people have a discussion, you bring your facts. And anyone who is a serious student of history knows that nobody knows everything.
Correct.
That as more information is being uncovered, it changes our perception of what we thought we knew. So it's very difficult to win an argument when you're talking with a fool. It's very difficult to win an argument when you're talking with someone who already has their mind made up. There's a saying, my mind is already made up, so don't confuse me with the truth. Mm-hmm. So we've seen here in this country, brother, within the last 7 years, how misinformation and disinformation have divided this country to the point where we may literally be standing on the verge of a civil war,
right?
Where any sense of normalcy and respect between two parties with opposing views has gone out the window. So to watch what's happening right now in Congress is an indicator of what's happening all over the world. It's not just here in the United States, it's happening all over the world. So it's like we're in a fight for the soul, not just of America, as certain politicians say. We're fighting for the soul of our consciousness. We're fighting for the soul of Africa. And I think if you're going to be engaged in that fight, you have to prepare yourself adequately. There is a statement that was made by, I think it was the U.S. Army in an ad that they did a couple of decades ago. They said that the first battle in any war takes place in the mind. Mm-hmm. And the first casualty of any war is always the truth, right? It's always the truth. So we have to be very clear about what we're talking about so that we can deal with the truth that stands on solid ground, and right, not a truth that liars speak in order to muddy the waters and to move people into a space where they won't be able to distinguish the truth from a half-truth, from an all-out lie. So these are the issues that I think that are so critically important for your listeners to understand. And it's also the reason why I just finished a 2-part webinar on why Nile Valley civilization matters. Okay. There's certain core information that has to be understood if you're going to engage anyone in any discussion about African history or Nile Valley history. And we've never been given the basic knowledge. So there are many people, unfortunately, who have a very pronounced presence on the web who read one book and all of a sudden become an expert on something that they know very little about.
Correct.
And so dealing with these issues, dealing with the larger issue is important. And that's also one of the reasons why we find here in the United States, there is an ongoing effort on the part of certain parties to suppress the teaching of African history, to suppress the teaching of American slavery. So, what's happening in Florida or Virginia or Texas is nothing but an effort on the part of a certain population to control the historical narrative and to perpetuate a point of view which disassociates them from decades of violence and murder and crimes against humanity. So I understand that. I understand why they're doing what they're doing because of what they have to protect. So my response to that is not to get angry for our former oppressors for saying that they're not going to continue to miseducate us. We have a responsibility and an obligation to educate ourselves. And that's what the Black consciousness movement was about in the 1960s, which led to the Black Studies movement, which has opened the door for us to have this level of conversation today. And there has always been pushback. There's always been pushback. And so we have to learn from the lessons of the past. learn how our scholars, our heroes and our sheroes were able to work around these obstacles that were placed in their path in order for them to continue to get the message out and raise multiple generations of people who now have a clearer understanding of what history is and why history is so critically important.
Absolutely. And, you talked about dealing with facts. And I have a saying, those that have been following me on the African History Network show, if we disagree, let's disagree based upon the facts and the evidence, not the fact that you don't want to deal with the evidence. Okay. Mm-hmm. Number one. Number two, you talk about marketing. So many people know my degree is in business administration with a major in marketing from Wayne State University. The foundation of marketing is psychology. So this is why a lot of this information I understand better than many people because of my training and having a background in sales and marketing, etc. You mentioned the Olmecs a few minutes ago. I want to hit on this and have you expound on it, and then talk some more about Nile Valley civilization and why this history is so important. So many people are familiar with Dr. David Imhotep, who wrote the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. He's a friend of mine. I've interviewed him probably 13, 14 times here on the African History Network show. And on page, I'm going to pull up this citation here because we discussed this in my classes also. What page is that in this book? He deals with the Olmec. He talks about the Olmec connection and what you just hit on. I want you to expound on this, because when we start talking about the African presence dealing with the Olmecs, we get a lot of pushback or people saying, "Oh, you're lying," things of this nature. Okay, so he deals with let's pull this up here. Mandinka Egyptian Olmec connection. Mandinka Egyptian Olmec connection. And I'm going to try to flip over to this slide here. Just bear with me for a second. I got to close out one of these presentations. All right. Let's look at this here. So he says, let's see here. Let's go to current slide. A major ethnic group. And now this is from page 82, I think it is, of The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. A major ethnic group among the ancient Egyptians were the Manding people, a Niger-Congo homeland in the general vicinity of the Upper Nile Valley, is probably as good a hypothesis as any for the origin of the Manding. And let me try to reconnect here. I want to show this slide. Okay, so we'll do this and let's go here. All right, resume slideshow. That's what we need. The Proto-Manding migration. The Proto-Manding migration had to have taken place during the African Aqualithic period. That was a wet period in Africa that lasted thousands of years at a time when the Sahara was fertile and had river systems and great lakes. All right. Now I'm going to try to. OK, so go ahead and talk about there's some more here I'll get to, but go ahead and talk about the Olmec connection, because when we talk about the Olmecs, you have people who say, oh, no, the Olmecs they had nothing to do with Africa or anything like that. Who were the Olmecs, and what's the connection between the Olmecs and ancient Kemet?
Sure. Well, anytime new ideas are introduced into the academy, there will be those who will reject those new ideas because reputations are built on maintaining certain concepts and ideas.
Right.
So as a matter of fact, one of the foremost Mesoamerican scholars was Michael Coe of Yale University. Mm-hmm. And he railed against Ivan Van Sertima and his publication, They Came Before Columbus, and the Olmecs, the fact that the Olmecs were African. It was Michael Coe who said, and there you go. I was going to ask you if you had any images of an Olmec head. This is perfect. Yeah. It was Michael Coe who stated, and this is someone with a PhD in Mesoamerican history who taught at Yale University. Michael Coe said that the reason why these Olmec statues had broad noses and thick lips is because the people who carved those statues didn't have the tools to make thin noses.
I've heard
and
that.
thin lips. All right. So that quote came from Michael Coe.
Okay. Spell his last name, please. Spell his last name.
C-O-E.
C-O-E.
Michael Coe.
Okay.
Yes. And Van Sertima, in describing this particular Olmec head, and this is at Villahermosa. I think it's at Villahermosa. No. Oh God, it'll come back to me.
Okay.
But this particular museum is an incredible museum, man. They have one of the largest collection of Olmec heads, and the Mexican architect who designed this museum, I think it is Villahermosa. The Mexican architect who designed this museum also designed the Nubia Museum in Aswan.
Okay.
Right? And so Van Sertima had pointed out that the helmet, the leather helmet that is worn by this Olmec personality and several other Olmecs is practically identical to the leather helmets worn by Nubian warriors.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So he's drawn a number of interesting parallels between these cultures. He's got maps in his book that shows the migratory pattern of the Olmecs from the west coast of Africa, who were able to catch currents that brought them over to the Americas. And one of the other points that Van Sertima brought out in many of his lectures that people want to dismiss or not discuss at all is the fact that these Africans who made the journeys, made multiple journeys, also brought back to the Nile Valley certain products. And one of the products that they brought back was cocoa leaves. The coca leaves, the plants from the plant that is used to make cocaine.
Right.
And very few people talk about the fact that when a examination of the mummy of Ramesses II, one of the most significant kings in Nile Valley history, when a examination was done on the contents of his stomach, they found coca leaves in his stomach, right? And they only existed at that time. They only existed in the so-called New World. So there's so many connections that have been, so much information about these migrations that have been suppressed in academia. So the other thing is there is a marvelous book that Charles Finch turned me on to, written by a Senegalese scholar by the name of Abubakar Lam. That book is entitled Paths from the Nile. And this book documents multiple migrations from the Nile River Valley into the Niger River Valley. So David Imhotep had talked about before the desertification of the Sahara, this region of northern Africa was grassland, and you had multiple river systems that ran from east to west. And so if we begin to explore this intercontinental migration of African people from the east to the west, from the Nile Valley to the Niger River Valley, we'll begin to find that there's tons and tons of history that is waiting to be rewritten, the artifacts that are waiting to be unearthed that will add to the story of African people and the migration of African people. And the only way that that story could be told intelligently is if more people of African ancestry get interested in the subject matter and do the primary research.
Right.
So, you know, I hope that what I have done throughout my career has served as a model to encourage others to get involved in traveling to Africa and doing the research, documenting what you found, and helping to bring this information out of the darkness into the light.
Absolutely. And, you know, you talk about primary research. Professor Manu Pim, who's a friend of mine as well, he talks about primary research as well. Dr. Leonard Jeffries, Professor James Small, those are two of my teachers, Professor Kabahai Wata Kamene, Dr. David Imhotep, they talk about the need for primary research. Okay, so this section here, this is from page 82 of The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. And as I said, Dr. David Imhotep deals with the Mandinka Egyptian Olmec connection, or the Manding. He said the Nile flowed west across the Sahara and emptied into the Atlantic Ocean during very ancient times. This would have enabled East Africans direct access to the Atlantic Ocean. The longer route would be to sail to the Nile River north to the Mediterranean Sea and then head west to the Atlantic Ocean. When the Manding reached Central America and began mixing with the local population, they were labeled Olmecs. Okay, when the Manding or Mandinka reached Central America and began mixing with the local population, they were labeled Olmecs. The Olmecs were supposedly a mixture of the Manding or Mandinka and American Indians, or people who we would term, Native Americans, or however you want to phrase that. Do not forget that the Manding made up the base of the Olmecs. So the Egyptians, or the ancient Kemetic people, the Kemet II, the ancient Kemites, the Manding and the base of the Olmecs are related to each other. So just briefly talk about that, because there's so much, there's so many attempts when we talk about the Olmecs, and we're not saying that the Olmecs did not have any Native American ancestry or anything like this. We're not trying to take away somebody else's history. We're trying to correct history.
Well, so a couple of things I want to add to that. One clarification I want to make is that the Nile Valley flows from south to north, but within the lower Nile Valley, you had other river systems that flowed from east to west. So I just want to clarify one thing. So it wasn't the Nile Valley that flowed from east to west.
It flows from south to north.
The tributaries that flowed off of the Nile, or fed into the Nile. So what that implies, a couple of things. Those of us who have studied Nile Valley civilization, the Nile River is the longest river in the world, 4,120 miles approximately. It begins in the highlands to the south. There are two primary sources for the Nile River: Lake Nyanza in Uganda, now known as Lake Victoria, because when Europeans discover Africans, they rename things that Africans had. But that's the source of the White Nile. And then you have the Blue Nile, which comes out of Lake Tana. The Blue Nile is the primary source for 90% of the water that flows from Khartoum north into the Mediterranean Sea through Kush and through Kemet. By the time the waters from the White Nile reach Khartoum, where the two rivers join together, 90% of the water from the White Nile has evaporated. So it's not only the water from Ethiopia, but the silt in the water from Ethiopia that made the Nile Valley, the lower Nile Valley, the most fertile land on earth. So Dr. John Henry Clark refers to the Nile Valley as the world's longest and oldest cultural highway. So we know the people, products, resources, in addition to the water, flow from south to north. So when you look at the development of Nile Valley civilization, you'll find that the primary science, the primary mythology, if you will, of Nile Valley civilization came out of the south, came out of the upper Nile Valley. And I'll share this with you, and then I'll go on to finish answering your question. So the primary mythology of Kemet and Kush is associated with Asar, Aset, and Heru, who we know better by their Greek names, Osiris, Isis, and Horus. They're the foundational mythology of Kemet. That story of Asar, Aset, and Heru that was instrumental in the founding of Kemet from the first dynasty on, that story originated in Ethiopia at least 4,000 to 6,000 years earlier. Among the people known in southern Ethiopia as the Omoro people, that same story is there. And as it flowed northward down the Nile, it modified over time, right? And became slightly interpreted, but that is a fundamental story. So you also had situations where as Africans migrated from south to the north, they also migrated from the east to the west. So there was this flow, this intergenerational transference of knowledge and technology over time and space from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of Africa. And much of that information is now really beginning to come out. And what it does, the coming of this information will shatter all of the myths about West Africa. And there are scholars now in Ghana, Senegal, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Mali, who are now talking about their ancestral migrations from the Nile River Valley into the Niger River Valley. So we're living in an age of incredible discoveries where new information is going to be coming forward. So as part of that migration of Africans from West Africa into the Americas, what we're talking about is the further transference of African knowledge and African technology. So those who have a vested interest in maintaining the concept of African people as having made no contribution to culture and civilization, they have to suppress this information.
Right.
So the Michael Coles of the world have to stand up. And so what we have to do is we reassemble the fragmented pieces of African history. We have to be able to look at exactly what you said, the omics. And Van Sertima talked about the fact that the omics, the remains, the physical remains of omics were found in many of the royal tombs in Mexico, and that they comprise, I think he said, about 12% of that population. So what we're looking at is an influx of Africans with advanced technology coming into a society and helping to jumpstart civilization in that society. And you also had other people coming from other areas into that same society as well. So as Van Wooteno and others have pointed out, there are other people from other parts of the world who made contributions to the culture that was established by the Olmecs. So as we now look back on approximately over 2,000 years of world history, we're trying to sift through all of this to get to the real story, right? And so the main point is we don't have to say that Africans invented everything in America, that Africans were the indigenous population in America. We don't have all of the evidence at this point in time to stand firmly on the truth to say that, but we can say beyond a shadow of doubt, based on the archaeological and historical information that we already have at our fingertips, that Africans from the Nile Valley played a pivotal role in helping to jumpstart culture and civilization in the Americas 2,500 years before Christopher Columbus was born. That's a fact. Mm-hmm. And so again, I'm not about just talking smack just to be talking smack. We talk facts. We talk facts based on the documented evidence that we have, and we also understand that not everybody is willing to accept the truth. Right. And so we teach the truth. We teach what we know to those who are ready to receive it. And we have to assume responsibility for doing that and not leave it to our former oppressor to teach our children, our most precious resource, teach our children information that will transform their consciousness. And with that transformation of consciousness, with them seeing themselves as people with a long documented history, as people with lives that matter, they will do what every culturally conscious person does, and that is tap into their ancestral memory. Right. See, that's really what all of this is mm-hmm. about, because when we look at the greater arc of human history, we have to acknowledge a fundamental fact that no people on this planet have been as marginalized as people of African ancestry have been on the continent and in the Americas. And part of that marginalization is about the usurpation of the historical memory of those right. people. And after the end of this process of enslavement, you still have to continue the enslavement of the mind, right? Correct. So whoever controls a person's thinking controls everything that they're able to do in their lifetime and everything that they're able to pass on to the lifetimes that will come after them. So it's a battle for the mind. It's always been a battle Correct. For the mind. And so knowing your history, going to sources, and being courageous enough to say, I don't know it mm-hmm. all, but I'm learning. As Neely Fuller says, I'm still learning. And as we learn, we get more information, and that information buttresses what we already know, or it provides a new kernel of truth that allows us to explore another field of study that expands what we thought we knew. Right. So this is the journey, and this to me is what this process is all about, man. And it's exciting. Yes. It's exciting to be engaged in this process. And it's also important to know that the closer you get to the truth, the more your enemies will try to suppress you.
Yes.
Right? That's when you know. That's when you know you're going in the right direction. So we can't allow ourselves. And I'm glad you put Dr. Jeffries up there again, because just 2 weeks ago, the powers that be came after his nephew, Hakeem Jeffries.
Representative Hakeem
That's
Jeffries.
not an accident. That's not an accident that is happening now. And they're bringing up issues that came to the fore in, what was that, 2001. 2001. Issues from 20 years ago, they're bringing it up. Why? Because Hakeem Jeffries represents this phenomenon that I'm truly beginning to embrace and wrap my mind around. And that is the major reason why people of African ancestry are still here. The reason why we have not been exterminated is because of the power that we carry within us, this genetic memory that has been driving us and allowing certain people within our group to overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. So it's not just us doing this, it's the ancestors working through us. And it's the acknowledgement of the ancestors, which has always been our greatest power, our greatest resource. So whatever others can do to make you feel that to be African is to be ignorant, to be African is to be shameful. Deny your African ancestry means that you deny your ancestors, which means you cut yourself off from your only salvation, right? So there, and unfortunately, brother, there are many of us, many of our people who deny that they're African.
Correct.
Who deny that African people have ever done anything of any significance, who have bought into the narrative, bought into the lie. Those people will be marginalized by their unwillingness to embrace a larger historical truth. And that's on them.
Right.
Not everybody is going to get it. Not everybody is capable of understanding what is at play. And that are those people who have always been in opposition to the restoration of the African mind, the restoration of African consciousness, will always fund those people who will undermine this effort. That has always been the case. That's part of what COINTELPRO is
Counterintelligence program, yes.
Yes, and also the use of government infiltrators to undermine organizations that were working on behalf of the advancement of African people. The Black Panther Party was infiltrated by these people. Anyone who saw Judas and the Black Messiah, right, saw that. And that story hit home to me because I'm from the west side of Chicago.
Okay.
You know, I know about Fred Hampton and Mara Clark. I was a freshman in college when Fred Hampton and Mara Clark were murdered. Went to school with a young lady who was in the house the night of the murder. So to have her give her description of what happened, and then to read in the newspaper, the Chicago Sun-Times, or to watch on the news, Mayor Daley, Edward Hammerhand, and other government officials give their version of the story, that's when the covers came off for me. That's when I began to realize that the media lies, the politician lies, that people have a vested interest in perpetuating a false narrative in order to maintain their power and suppress any effort on the part of African people to free their minds. So these issues are critical, man. And we cannot, you know, we cannot have a short-term memory when we're dealing with long-term issues. Look at what happened in the 60s. Look at the rise of the Black Power movement, the Black Consciousness movement, and the things that the government did to shut that down. The introduction of drugs into our community. Again, I'm from the west side of Chicago, so I can tell you specifically what happened when cocaine was allowed to come into the community unabated. What the film, and this is again the power of the media, what the film Superfly did to destroy conscious Black folk on the west side of Chicago.
Right, the original Superfly with Ron O'Neal, the original Superfly. Yes,
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So I was in Chicago, man, when that film came out, and I saw how cocaine
when the blaxploitation movies, and very quickly, and I know we only have a few minutes left here because I know you got to run. A couple things I want to hit on that, but very quickly because people are asking. Also, if you want to support the African History Network, you could do so. Cash App, $ the AHN Show through Cash App or through PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN Show. We have the links on our website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. theafricanhistorynetwork.com. I put the links there because some people have set up fake African History Network Cash App accounts and they've been stealing money from us. Okay. So we have the actual links there. You can click on it to support Tony Browder and the work that he and his daughter Atlantis Browder do. Okay. Go to IKG-info.com, IKG-info.com. You mentioned Superfly, and I want to talk about that for just a quick minute, and then have you connect Nile Valley civilization and history to Queen Cleopatra, put it in a historical correct context. Okay, we're not going to let that dominate the conversation. Nathan McCall, the author Nathan McCall, he had a book out in the 1990s called Makes Me Wanna Holler. African-American Man Makes Me Wanna Holler. And I read his book, and he talked about how in the 70s the movie Superfly made he and his friends want to sell drugs, to live that type of lifestyle. Okay. And he ended up going to prison. He became a journalist. I think it was either the Washington Post he ended up writing for. Washington Post. Yeah, I read his book, and his book was fantastic. And I had the book on tape, but that deals with the power of the media. Okay. And Dr. Leonard Jeffries has talked about previously how those blaxploitation movies, not all of them, there were some good movies, but how some of those movies showed us in the worst light and promoted drug usage, pimping, selling drugs, things of this nature. And white people profited off of these degrading images of African Americans. Right after Dr. King's assassinated in 1968, Malcolm X assassinated in 65, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense is infiltrated and largely derailed. Okay. And then you have these movies. So we got to understand that chronology. Connect the Nile Valley civilization history to putting Queen Cleopatra VII in the correct historical context, please.
Great. So the perfect example I can give you is the work of Dr. Asa G. Hilliard III, who established a framework for understanding Nile Valley civilization. And he divided Nile Valley civilization into 4 golden ages. The first golden age was dynasties 3 through 6, when all of the Mir or pyramids were constructed. The second golden age was dynasties 11 and 12, when all of the great literature, the philosophical literature, the scientific literature, the moral literature for the nation was established during that period of time. The third golden age and the longest golden age is dynasties 18 and 19, when Kemet was forced to become an imperialistic nation because of continued intrusions from the north. And then you have the last golden age, the fourth and final golden age, which is the 25th dynasty, which is what Dr. John Henry Clark referred to as Africa's last great walk in the sun. It was the last time in history that Africans were the wealthiest and most powerful people on the planet. So if you understand that framework, then after the 25th dynasty, and there were 30 dynasties in the history of dynastic Egypt, Kemet civilization fell in 332 BC with the advent of Alexander of Macedonia conquering Kemet and turning Kemet into Egypt. Egypt is a Greek word. Pyramid is a Egypt Greek. Is a Greek word. So most of the names of African places and things and people have been changed by non-African people. So if you don't know the original names, you'll never be able to understand the history, the culture, the science, the philosophy, and the concepts as they were originally created. Let me give you one example of that. Pyramid is a Greek word, which means little flat cake, like a pancake. The original word for that structure is Mir, M-I-R. And the word Mir means the place of ascension. So Mir, there are no bodies buried in any pyramids of Mir in the entire Nile Valley. None, zero. So anytime anybody tells you that the pyramids were tombs, that is a lie, whether it's an intentional lie or unintentional lie based on ignorance. Mir were always built over tombs. The tombs were underground. So the word Mir means the place of ascension. The place of ascension. And the purpose of a mir was to facilitate the ascension of the soul buried underneath it into heaven, where that soul would be reborn. And they were very specific about where in heaven a soul would go to be reborn. So the first text which documented this journey of the soul into the afterlife was carved in the burial chamber of a tomb known as the Pyramid of Unas, right? So it's in his burial chamber where you find the oldest written religious documents in the world were inscribed on the walls of this particular tomb that talks about the soul, that talks about the process for the salvation of the soul, that talks about the judgment of the soul, and the place where souls go to be reborn. So the framework for Western religions can be found in the Nile Valley. So it's important to reclaim the names. It's important to understand chronology and history. So in that context, yes, Alexander of Macedonia conquered Kemet in 332 BC, and the word Egypt derived from the name Ha-Ka-Ptah, which is the temple of the spirit of Ptah in the city of Mennefer, which was later renamed Memphis by the Greeks. And so that word Ha-Ka-Ptah became Aegyptus, which was Latinized and became Egypt. Yes. That's how that word devolved. Not evolved, it devolved because it lost its essence through the evolution of the word. And so once Alexander conquered Kemet, and he became so enamored by the 3,000 years of historical knowledge that he had inherited by virtue of conquest. And so he no longer referred to himself as Alexander, son of Philip of Macedonia. He called himself Alexander, son of Ammon, son of Amen, the unseen presence of God Almighty, which is a upper Nile Valley concept, right? And so the Greek rulers then descended from Alexander's line, and Cleopatra is the last of these Greek rulers. So Cleopatra, for all intents and purposes, Cleopatra was not African. She was not Kemetic in the literal sense of the word. And so my thing is, don't get caught up in Cleopatra. There are other personalities of more historical and cultural significance who we should be focusing our attention on. So I would bypass Cleopatra discussion and focus on Queen T, who was one of the baddest queens in human history. She was one of the most powerful rulers on earth. She was the wife of Imhotep III, and their statue in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo is the largest statue in that building. And anyone who looks upon that statue could see the nationality or the race, if you will, of who these two African people were. And it's very clear that we understand the chronology. Queen T was the wife of Amenhotep III. The son was Amenhotep IV, who changed his name to Akhenaten. And Akhenaten's son was the person that we call King Tut. So if you understand the history, understand the chronology, you can focus your attention on subject matters that are more worthy of discussion than Cleopatra. Not to dismiss her summarily, but Cleopatra is about as significant as Meghan Markle. I'm just saying.
Right.
Context is everything. Context is everything. So look at, and there, thank you for that image of Queen T. Now, that's a very small image of Queen T. And what I would also suggest those of your listeners who live in New York, go to the Metropolitan Museum, the Met Museum, and you'll see an image of Queen T in the Met Museum. But that image of Queen T has half of her face destroyed. And there was an article that was written in the 1970s that was an attack against African-centered scholars. And Asa Hilliard brought this knowledge to our attention. The people from the New York Times had interviewed him as part of this same debate that folk are having right now about Cleopatra and African history. And Asa Hilliard showed this image of Queen T. And this image of Queen T, I love it so much because it reminds me so much of my dear friend, Dr. Francis Chris Wilson, with the afro, the stern look, and a woman who was clearly in control of herself and her destiny. So Asa referenced that face of Queen T in the Metropolitan Museum with half the face knocked off. So they had an opportunity, the New York Times had an opportunity to tell the truth, but they chose not to. And so these are the games that we're playing with, and we have to, be very careful about who we get our information from. We should read everything, but read everything with a critical eye so that you can discern when someone is being deceptive. You can discern when you're being immersed into aspects of the truth so that you can ground yourself on the truth and not be led astray by arguments or false narratives that are designed to neutralize your strength, your power, and to waste time.
Yes.
No, we really don't have any time to waste.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of time, I know you have to run, so I want you to let people know about. You told me Egypt on the Potomac tour is going to start back up. Give people the website, and then family watching. As soon as we finish with Tony, I'll let you know about my online history classes I teach on Saturdays and Sundays, because we have a class today at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Go ahead, Tony.
So through our company, IKG, we have been presenting this information for over 40 years. We've done numerous publications. We have numerous activities. One of our most significant activities is our Egypt on the Potomac field trip, which is something that I created in 1986. So Egypt on the Potomac is designed to show people the Egyptian presence, the Kemetic presence in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And I've done research. We've been doing this for well over 30 years, and no one has ever challenged me based on the information that we put forward to show that America's founding fathers chose examples from the Nile Valley, from Kush and Kemet, in order to establish the foundation for what has become the capital of the wealthiest, most powerful nation in human history. So that activity has been curtailed for the past 3 years because of COVID. But beginning on May the 6th, we will have our regular 3-hour bus field trip of Washington, D.C., where we will take you through locations, various locations throughout the city, and explain the architectural, the symbolic, and the mythological elements of Nile Valley civilization, which have literally been hidden in plain sight. We connect the dots, and we empower people with the ability to see their history and use that history to transform their consciousness. So anyone can go to our website, ikg-info.com. We also have another project that we're going to be unveiling at the Thurgood Marshall Center, where we're based in D.C. It's the John Henry Clark Enhanced History Project. This project, we have 400 square feet of wall space where we're going to be using information inspired by the work of John Henry Clark to tell the story of people who have been written out of the respectable commentary of human history. And this project is my response to certain historical shortcomings in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is a phenomenal structure. The only issue that I have with it is that it begins our history in the basement, and it begins our history with slavery.
Right.
It doesn't talk about who we were prior to our enslavement.
Exactly.
So the cornerstone of the John Henry Clark Enhanced History Project is a 25-foot long mural, which illustrates 8,000 years of African excellence and success, an undeniable 8,000 years of African excellence and success, which was undermined by the Ma'afa, the European and Arab enslavement of African people. But we have come through the Ma'afa. We have survived. Yes. And through the work that you're doing, through the work that others are doing, we are doing our best to bring forbidden knowledge into the community that needs the knowledge the most, so that they can transform their consciousness and create a world that is worthy of their children and their children's children's inheriting, based on accessing ancestral knowledge and recreating the genius that we were born with. So that's the process, man. And let me just, in closing, let me just share that my good colleague, Charles French, has a new book coming out next month. It's 10,000 years of Nile Valley history.
Okay.
10,000 years of Nile Valley history. So I'm really pleased to see that there's more scholars, more sisters and brothers who are doing the work and documenting a history that has been suppressed for so long. And all we have to do is read and study and create spaces within our home. Every home should have a library.
Correct.
Right? The parents in those homes should spend time reading with your children and having intelligent discussions about how to articulate that history. Everybody pays taxes, and our tax dollars are being used in schools to miseducate many children, black, brown, white, children in the classroom.
Right.
So we have an obligation as taxpayers to see to it that certain information is accessible in the classroom. And if it's not going to be taught in the classroom, we need to demand of our churches, our fraternities, our sororities, our barbershops and beauty shops to turn those spaces into spaces where we can teach our children and their parents and elders in the community who they are.
Correct.
So we can transform our consciousness. And I'll close on this point. You know, I'm kind of peeved that folk are spending too much time talking about Cleopatra. And I need to hear folk talk about what's wrong with Megan Thee Stallion. What's wrong with Cardi
Hey,
B.
brother, they don't want to have that
Because-
conversation. Oh, let me just say quickly, and I'll let you go ahead and finish. Dude, the information I put out about the song WAP from Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion. Now, here's the thing. When we do a systems analysis, I went through and broke this whole thing down. And I said they would never have a top white female artist put out sexually explicit lyrics like that, because they understand that whatever's disseminated becomes imitated. And they have too much respect for white women. But here's the thing. The majority of my criticism of WAP and the whole thing in the video wasn't towards Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion, even though I would say they get 10%. The majority of the criticism I had was for Atlantic Records, a white corporation, financing this, because they would not do that for a white woman. And the baseline says there's some whores in this house and repeats that phrase about 79 times. And in the video, all the women are of African descent except Kylie Jenner. And you have white people to put together an online petition to have Kylie Jenner digitally removed from the video because you only protect what you respect. And they saw that white woman as somebody who needed to be saved. You Negroes, you can keep doing that. You can be the whores in this house. This white woman, you too good for that. Go ahead, brother.
All right. So I mean, but and that's a valid point, and it speaks to exactly the point that I want to make. People who love themselves and love their women and love their children do not allow their image to be
Exactly.
The other important issue is I travel around the world, brother. And once you get outside of America, you see a whole different world. And what embarrasses me is to see these videos on television stations in Africa, in Europe, in South America. And I would say this. In all fairness, all right, if you want to show black women behaving this way, then let's see some white women behaving that way. Let's see some Jewish. Let's level the playing field. But it's only us because it's about disparaging us, and it's about maintaining this ideology of Afrophobia, this fear of black folk, this disrespect for black folk. And so we have to accept responsibility for that. So I'm not going to let Megan Thee Stallion and Cardi B off the hook. I'm not going to let them off the hook because they are rewarded for that. By Megan Thee Stallion was Person of the Year, Time Magazine. They appear on Saturday Night Live. They appear on all of these programs. So what that does is send a message to young and impressionable black women, black girls. If you want to get paid, if you want respect, wear weave, wear these fake nails, wear all of these things that deny your true essence in order to be accepted by a community that has never had any interest or desire in you. And so these are conversations that need to be had. Many of these conversations, I think, should be had behind closed doors and not on the internet, because you never know who's listening. We need to have private conversations, and we need to talk about how we can advance the culture and present favorable images of us, because the media, as I stated at the beginning of this conversation, the media is the most powerful form of mental manipulation ever created. And we're getting played.
Right.
We're getting played. So, I always encourage people to take responsibility for yourself, to think before you speak, and to think about the long-term implications of everything you do. So emotion is all right, but emotion needs to be balanced with intelligence. It needs to be balanced with the ability to articulate what you think and to associate with people who are doing the same thing. The reality is, what I've learned over my 71 years of life here on planet Earth is that this information is not for everybody. You're not going to get everybody. It ain't about everybody. It's about moving and working with those people who are willing to learn, willing to commit themselves to something greater than their own individual and selfish interests. It's about building for future generations. So that process is happening, brothers. I'm encountering more younger sisters and brothers. When I say younger, I mean folk in their 20s, 30s, and 40s who are finally getting it, who are thirsty, who want this information. These are the people that we need to be focusing on. We need to help frame the historical understanding of topics so that they don't get sidetracked by these games, by these traps that are set up just to waste their time, but stay focused like a laser, do the work, love yourself, right? And demonstrate that love and how you interact with other people who look like you, and build something tangible together that is going to outlive you, something tangible that can be passed on to future generations. And if you can do that, man, if you can do that throughout your lifetime, then we can say that the day will come when our ancestors will return and have bodies to use that will allow them to create heaven on earth once again. It doesn't make sense to me, and I keep saying I'm going to close on this. But
hey, take your time, man. I know you got something to do after this, but take your time. I'm not rushing you. Okay.
It doesn't make sense for me personally to talk about your ancestors were kings and queens if you're acting like fools and jokers, right?
Yep.
And the other reality is that less than 0.1% of any nation's rulers were kings and queens. The vast majority of people were ministers and prime ministers, were scholars, were researchers, were scientists, were astronomers, were physicians, were healers, were masons, were architects and engineers. They are the people who made the nation. Right. The king or queen was just a figurehead. Right. So I want to redirect the conversation. I want to redirect the focus on something that is practical. It's just like saying, you want to be president of the United States. Anybody with any sense knows the president of the United States does not run the United States, right? And so it's the people who comprise this country who make this country what it is. And we know, people of African ancestry should understand very clearly that it was our ancestors and their free labor that helped to make this country the wealthiest and most powerful nation in human history. So we have an obligation as descendants of enslaved people who survived the Ma'afa. We have an obligation and a responsibility to use the resources that we have access here in this country to educate ourselves, right? Because what we know shapes the consciousness of African people all around the world. We talked earlier about the Black consciousness movement in the 1960s. And the powers that be saw how the Black Power movement influenced Steve Biko in South Africa. And he replicated a similar movement. It was happening in other parts of Africa as well. So the colonizers had to shut that down. And you shut that down by introducing films that divert our attention and have us praising drug dealers and ungodly behavior. And that then becomes the framework with which we see our future. So if we use this technology properly, we have the opportunity to access millions of minds in a matter of minutes and introduce a new narrative. That's what this opposition is all about.
Yes.
Shutting down the conversation, shutting down the power. So don't give your power away. You are the most important commodity that you'll ever possess. Free your mind. Model how free people, free men and women are supposed to speak, communicate, and move through the planet. Work with other people of like minds so that you can build something that will last for eternity. And as we do that, we will make our ancestors proud. And we then will be the vehicles through which they would do their best work. Why? Because they did it in the past. And we have the capacity to replicate it right now. That's what this whole journey is all about.
Absolutely. And up on the screen, I have the famous quote by Bantu Stephen Biko: "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." So we have to take our minds back. This is what Dr. Carter G. Woodson was telling us in his work, not just in the Miseducation of the Negro in 1933, but the work he did with Association for the Study of African American Life and History of SALA, which he co-founded September 9th, 1915. So, all right, excellent. We got to bring you back, Tony. I know you got to run. We have to bring you back. And everybody, those slides I was showing, those are all slides from the online classes that I teach. We use 2 of your books, Egypt on the Potomac and Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. in my classes as well. I introduce a lot of people to you, Tony. I read this book back in 1994. I just got this new copy last year from Brother Hakeem Shakur. But my original copies from 1994, the pages were falling out. I had to get a new copy, man. But that book I read from the Browder file first. Then in 94 when I was at Wayne State University, I read Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. It blew my mind, man. I haven't been right since. Okay. It corrected my mind. Right. You have been right. It corrected my mind, man, but it blew me away, brother. So you got to write. This is volume 1, man. You got to write volume 2. You got about 20 volumes in you, brother, man. But you got to write volume 2, brother.
Well, brother, that's one of the reasons why I need to use the time that I have left to redirect my energies. I've got a ton of information that I need to get out.
Yes.
And so I'm going to be focusing on doing more writing and continuing to push my daughter out, because what I have established is a legacy that she's going to continue. Mm-hmm. So, last December, I had some health challenges and I was unable to travel to Egypt, take my group to Egypt. So my daughter stepped up and did it.
Oh, that's good.
So to
Shout
know
out to
that we're preparing the next generation, man, is really what this thing is all about. Because we're not going to live forever, and we can't do everything ourselves. So we should be training cadres of young people, man, to know who they are and to live that knowledge in everything that they do. That then is how we change the world. So, it's a pleasure to be on the program.
We got to have you back soon, brother. Yeah. And I'm wearing the Black Friday shirt because we're in the documentary series from Rick Mathis, director Rick Mathis, Black Friday, What Legacy Will You Leave? Okay. All right, Tony, everybody visit ikg-info.com. Support Tony Browder, support his daughter, Atlantis Browder, and also support the African History Network. All right, Tony, you have a good day, brother. Hotep. All right, peace.
Take care, man.
Appreciate
it. Peace to you.
All right, everybody. So that was one of our esteemed scholars, one of my friends for years, Tony Browder. He was one of my first interviews that I did in 2010 when I launched the African History Network show. Hotep, everybody. This is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. It is Saturday, June 1st, 2024. And we are live, and I wanted to come on for a few minutes and invite you to join me at our online school for our multi-week online history course that I teach, called Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. We have another class session that we have starting today in a few minutes. And we deal with thousands of years of history and what leads up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. I do a PowerPoint presentation. We have book references, articles, video clips, and we deal with thousands of years of history. And we look at chronologically what leads to the transatlantic slave trade taking place and what's the impact of it. Okay. There are 15 different books that we reference, 200 slides, over 200 slides that I put together. Some of the things we look at are the impact of Juneteenth and how a lot of Americans don't understand Juneteenth and the significance of it, but also the fact that slavery didn't end on June 19th, 1865. And I've done extensive presentations on that. I'll be speaking at some Juneteenth presentations here in the Detroit area. We talk about ancient Africa and who Imhotep was. We deal with things like the 1619 Project and what the 1619 Project gets wrong about the African presence in America, because Africans were here in the land we call the United States of America, going back at least 51,700 years ago. These were the Khoisan, and we did not first come to this country conquered and shackled in chains, conquered by Europeans. That's misinformation. Yes, 1619 did happen, but before 1619, there was 1526 in the South Carolina, Georgia area. And that was an attempt by the Spanish to set up a settlement. That attempt failed, but there were about 100 Africans that were taken into that area, and we're going to overthrow our oppressors. Okay. Now, this is 93 years before 1619, Jamestown, Virginia, but this is not talked about a lot. Okay. But there's a good article from the Washington Post. Before 1619, there was 1526, the mystery of the first enslaved Africans and what became the United States. But even before this, even though this history right here is important,